Hello, everybody, and welcome to Storytime with Miss Peggy again. Glad to see you. I wish I could see you in person, as I said the other night. But anyway, I'm glad that we can at least be together electronically. Today, we're going to start reading Chapter 5, which is entitled Back on This Side of the Door. And remember that in the last chapter that we read, Edmund had gotten into Narnia as well, and that he had met the White Witch, and that she had tempted him with enchanted Turkish delight, and that he was now well and truly soaked in sin, you might say. It had really poisoned his heart against his sister and against his brother and his other sister, and made his life pretty miserable already. And however, Lucy didn't realize any of this, and the last few words of chapter 4 were, as they had come back into the wardrobe and were now in the empty room, Lucy said to Edmund, "Come on then," said Lucy, "let's find the others. What a lot we shall have to tell them, and what wonderful adventures we shall have now that we're all in it together." Chapter 5, Back on This Side of the Door. Because the game of hide and seek was still going on, it took Edmund and Lucy some time to find the others. But when at last they were all together, which happened in the long room where the suit of armor was, Lucy burst out, "Peter, Susan, it is all true. Edmund has seen it too. There is a country you can get through the wardrobe. Edmund and I both got in. We met one another in the woods there. Go on, Edmund, tell them all about it." "What's all this about, Ed?" said Peter. And now we come to one of the nastiest things in this story. Up till that moment, Edmund had been feeling sick and sulky and annoyed with Lucy for being right, but he hadn't made up his mind what to do. When Peter suddenly asked him the question, he decided all at once to do the meanest and most spiteful thing he could think of. He decided to let Lucy down. "Tell us, Ed," said Susan. And Edmund gave a very superior look, as if he were far older than Lucy. There was really only a year's difference. And then with a little snigger, he said, "Oh, yes, Lucy and I have been playing, pretending that all her story about a country in the wardrobe was true, just for fun, of course. There's really nothing to it." Poor Lucy gave Edmund one look and rushed out of the room. Edmund, who was becoming a nastier person every minute, thought that he had scored a great success. And he went on at once to say, "There she goes again. What is the matter with her? That's the worst of young kids. They're always—" "Look here," said Peter, turning on him savagely. "Shut up. You have been perfectly beastly to Lou ever since she started this nonsense about the wardrobe, and now you go playing games with her about it and setting her off again. I think you did it purely out of spite." "But it's all nonsense," said Edmund, very taken aback. "Of course it's all nonsense," said Peter. "That's just the point. Lou was perfectly all right when we left home, but since we got down here, she seems to be getting queer in the head, or else she's turning into a frightful liar. But whatever it is, what good do you think it'll do her to jeer at her and nag her one day and encourage her the next?" I thought, said Edmund, but he couldn't think of anything to say. "You didn't think anything at all," said Peter. "It was just spite. You've always liked being beastly to anyone smaller than yourself. We've seen that at school before now." "Oh, do stop it," said Susan. "It won't make anything better, having a row between the two of you. Let's go and find Lucy." It's not surprising that when they did find Lucy a good deal later, everyone could see that she'd been crying. Nothing they could say to her made any difference. She stuck to her story, and she said, "I don't care what you think. I don't care what you say. You can call the professor. You can write to Mother. You could do anything you want to. I did meet a fawn in there, and I wish I'd stayed there. And you all are just beasts. Beasts!" It was an unpleasant evening, and Lucy was miserable, and Edmund was beginning to feel that his plan wasn't working out quite as well as he had expected. The two older ones were really beginning to think that Lucy was out of her mind. They stood in the passage talking in whispers long after she had gone to bed. The result was that the next morning they decided that they'd better go and tell the whole thing to the professor. "He'll write to father if he thinks there really is something wrong with Lou," said Peter. "It's getting beyond us." So they went and knocked on the study door, and the professor said, "Come in." And he got up and found chairs for them and said that he was quite at their disposal. And then he sat listening to them with the tips of his fingers pressed together, never interrupting until they had finished the whole story. After that, he said nothing for quite a long time. Then he cleared his throat and said the last thing that either of them expected. "How do you know," he said, "that your sister's story is not true?" "Oh, but," began Susan, and then she stopped. Anyone could see from the old man's face that he was perfectly serious. But then Susan pulled herself together and said, "But Edmund said they had only been pretending." "That is a point," said the professor. "It certainly deserves consideration, very careful consideration. For instance, if you will excuse me for asking this question, does your experience lead you to believe your brother or your sister as the most reliable? I mean, which of them is the more truthful?" "Well, that's the funny thing about it, sir," said Peter. "Up until now, I'd have said Lucy every time." "And what do you think, my dear?" he said, turning to Susan. "Well," said Susan, "in general, I'd say the same as Peter, but this couldn't be true, all that stuff about a fawn and a wood." "Well, that's more than I know," said the professor. "And a charge of lying against someone whom you have always found very truthful is a very serious thing indeed." "We were afraid that it might not even be lying," said Susan. "We thought that there might be something wrong with Lucy." "Madness, you mean?" said the professor quite coolly. "Oh, you can make your minds easy about that. One only has to look at her and talk to her to know she's not mad." "But then," said Susan, and she stopped. She had never dreamed that a grown-up would talk like the professor, and she didn't know what to think. "Logic," said the professor half to himself. "Why don't they teach logic at these schools? There are only three possibilities. Either your sister is telling lies, or she is mad, or she is telling the truth. You know she doesn't tell lies, and it's obvious that she's not mad. For the moment, then, and until any further evidence turns up, we must assume that she's telling the truth." Susan looked at him very hard and was quite sure from the expression on his face that he was not making fun of them. "But how could that be true, sir?" said Peter. "Why do you say that?" said Professor. "Well, for one thing," said Peter, "if it was real, why doesn't everyone find this country every time they go in the wardrobe? I mean, there was nothing there when we looked, and even Lucy didn't pretend there was." "What has that to do with it?" said the professor. "Well, sir, if things are real, they're there all the time." "Are they?" said the professor, and Peter didn't know quite what to say. "But there was no time," said Susan. "Lucy had no time to go anywhere, even if there were such a place. She came running after us the very moment we were out of the room. It had been less than a minute, and she pretended to have been away for hours." "Well, that's the very thing that makes her story so likely to be true," said the professor. "If there really is a door in this house that leads to some other world, and I should warn you that this is a very strange house, and even I know very little about it. If, I say, she had gotten into another world, I would be not at all surprised to find that the other world had a separate time of its own, so that however long you spent here, or however long you spent there, it would never take up any of our time here. On the other hand, I don't think many girls of her age would invent that idea for themselves. If she had been pretending, she would have hidden for a reasonable length of time before coming out and telling her story." "But do you really mean, sir," said Peter, "that there could be other worlds all over the place, just around the corner, like that?" "Nothing is more probable," said the professor. taking off his spectacles and beginning to polish them while he muttered to himself, "I wonder what they do teach them in those schools." "But what are we to do?" said Susan. She felt that the conversation was beginning to get off the point. "My dear young lady," said the professor, suddenly looking up with a very sharp expression in his eyes, "there is one plan which none of you has suggested and which is well worth trying." "What's that?" said Susan. "We all might try minding our own business," he said. And after that was the end of the conversation. After this, things were a good deal better for Lucy. Peter saw to it that Edmund stopped jeering at her, and neither she nor anyone else felt inclined to talk about the wardrobe at all. It had become a rather alarming subject. And so for a long time it looked as if all the adventures were coming to an end. But that was not to be. This house of the professor's, which even he knew so little about, was old and famous, and people from all over England used to come and ask permission to visit. It was the sort of house that's mentioned in guidebooks and even in histories, and, well, it might be, for all manner of stories were told about it, some of them even stranger than the one I'm telling you now. And when groups of sightseers arrived and asked to see the house, the professor always gave them permission, and Mrs. Macready, the housekeeper, showed them around, telling them about the pictures and the armor and the rare books in the library. Well, here's a picture of the professor with Susan and Peter. Okay? And here's a picture of the old house there, so that you get an idea of the size of it. Huge, isn't it? Mrs. Macready was not fond of children and did not like to be interrupted when she was telling visitors all the things she knew. She had said to Peter and to Susan on the first morning that they were there, along with a good many other instructions, "And please remember that you're to keep out of the way whenever I'm taking visitors around the house." Just as if any one of us would want to waste half the morning trailing around with a group of strange grown-ups, said Edmund, and the other three thought the same. And that's how the adventures began for the second time. A few mornings later, Peter and Edmund were looking at the suit of armor and wondering if they could take it to bits, when the two girls rushed into the room and said, "Look out, here comes Macready and a whole gang with her." "All right," said Peter, and all four made off through the door at the far end of the room. But when they got out into the green room and beyond it into the library, they suddenly heard voices ahead of them, and they realized that Mrs. Macready must be bringing her party of sightseers up the back stairs instead of up the front stairs as they had expected. And after that, whether it's because they lost their heads, or that Mrs. Macready was trying to catch them, or that some magic in the house had come to life and was chasing them into Narnia, they seemed to find themselves being followed everywhere. Until at last Susan said, "Oh, bother all those visitors here. Let's get into the wardrobe until they've passed. No one will follow us in there." But the moment they were inside, they heard voices in the passage, and then fumbling at the door, and they saw the handle turning. "Quick," said Peter, "there's no one else." And they flung open the door of the wardrobe, and all four of them bundled inside and sat there, panting in the dark. Peter held the door closed, but he didn't shut it. For, of course, he remembered, as every sensible person does, that you should never shut yourself up in a wardrobe. Chapter 6, Into the Forest. "I wish Macready would hurry up and take all those people away," said Susan. "I'm getting horribly cramped." "And what an awful smell of mothballs," said Edmund. "I expect the pockets of these coats are full of them," said Susan, "to keep away the moths." "There's something sticking into my back," said Peter. "And it's getting so cold," said Susan. "Now that you mention it, it is cold, and hang it all, it's wet too. What is the matter with this place? I'm sitting in something wet, and I'm getting wetter every minute." He struggled to his feet. "Well, let's go out," said Edmund. "They've gone." "Ooh," said Susan. And everyone asked her what's the matter. "I'm sitting against a tree," said Susan, "and look, it's getting light over there." By Jove, you're right, said Peter. And look there, and there, it's trees all around. And this wet stuff is snow. Why, I do believe we've gotten into Lucy's woods after all. And now there was no mistaking it, and all four children stood blinking in the daylight of a winter day. Behind them there were coats hanging on pegs. In front of them there were snow-covered trees. Peter turned at once to Lucy. I'm sorry for not believing in you, Lucy, and I apologize. Will you shake hands? Of course, said Lucy, and she did. And now, said Susan, what do we do next? Do? Said Peter. Why, go and explore the woods, of course. Ugh, said Susan, it's pretty cold. How about if we put on some of those coats? Well, they're not ours, said Peter doubtfully. I'm sure no one would mind, said Susan. It isn't as if we wanted to take them out of the house. We really shan't even be taking them out of the wardrobe. Well, I never thought of that, Sue, said Peter. Of course, now that you put it that way, I see. No one could say you've stolen a coat as long as you leave it in the wardrobe where you found it. And I suppose this whole country is the wardrobe. They immediately carried out Susan's very sensible plan. The coats were rather too big for them, so they came down to their heels and looked more like royal robes than the coats when they put them on, but they all felt a good deal warmer, and each of them thought the others looked better in their new get-ups and much more suitable to the landscape. We can pretend we're Arctic explorers, said Lucy. Well, this is going to be exciting enough without pretending, said Peter, as he began to lead the way forward into the forest. There were heavy, darkish clouds overhead, and it looked like it might snow again before nightfall. I say, said Edmund presently, shouldn't we be bearing a little more to the left if we're aiming for the lamp post? He had forgotten for the moment that he must keep on pretending never to have been into the woods before. But the moment the words were out of his mouth, he realized that he had given himself away. Everyone stopped. Everyone stared at him. Peter whistled. Whew, so you really were here, he said, that time that Lou said she met you in here, and you made out that she was telling lies. There was a dead silence. Well, of all the poisonous little beasts, said Peter, and shrugged his shoulders and said no more. There was, it seemed, nothing more to say. And presently the four of them resumed their journey, but Edmund was saying to himself, I'll pay you back for this, you pack of stuck-up, self-satisfied prigs. Where are we going anyway, said Susan, chiefly for the sake of changing the subject. Well, I think Lou ought to be the leader. Goodness knows she deserves it. Where are you going to take us, Lou? Well, how about going to see Mr. Tumnus, said Lucy. He's the nice fawn I told you about. Everyone agreed to this, and off they went, walking briskly and stamping their feet. And Lucy proved to be a good leader. At first she wondered whether she would be able to find the way, but she recognized an odd-looking tree in one place and a stump in another, and brought them on to where the ground became uneven, and into the little valley, and at last to the very door of Mr. Tumnus's cave. But there, a terrible surprise awaited them. The door had been wrenched off its hinges and broken to bits. Inside, the cave was dark and cold, and had the damp feel and smell of a place that had not been lived in for several days. Snow had drifted in from the doorway and was heaped up on the floor, mixed with something black, which turned out to be the charred sticks and ashes from the fire. Someone had apparently flung them around the room and then stamped the fire out. The dishes lay smashed on the floor, and the picture of the fawn's father had been slashed into shreds with a knife. This is awful. Not much good in coming here, said Edmund. What is this? Said the Peter, stooping down. He had just noticed a piece of paper which had been nailed through the carpet to the floor. There's a picture of the doorway of poor Mr. Tumnus's house with the wreckage of the door lying on the ground there. What is this? Said Peter, stooping down. He had just noticed a piece of paper which had been nailed through the carpet to the floor. Is there anything written on it? Asked Susan. Yes, I think there is, answered Peter. But I can't read it in this light. Let's get it out into the open air. They all went out into the daylight and crowded around Peter as he read the following words. The former occupant of these premises, the Fawn Tumnus, is under arrest and awaiting his trial on a charge of high treason under Her Imperial Majesty Jadis, Queen of Narnia, Chatelaine of Cair Paravel, Empress of the Lone Islands, etc., and also of comforting Her said Majesty's enemies, harboring spies and fraternizing with humans. Signed, Mogrim, Captain of the Secret Police. Long live the Queen! The children stared at each other. I don't know that I'm going to like this place after all, said Susan. Who is this Queen, Lou? Said Peter. Do you know anything about her? Well, she isn't a real queen at all, answered Lucy. She's a horrible witch, the White Witch. Everyone, all the wood people, hate her. She's made an enchantment over the whole country so that it's always winter here and never Christmas. I wonder if there's any point in going on, said Susan. I mean, it doesn't seem particularly safe here, and it's getting colder every minute, and we've brought nothing to eat. What about just going home? Oh, but we can't, said Lucy suddenly. Don't you see? We can't just go home, not after this. It's all on my account that poor Fawn has gotten into this trouble. He hid me from the witch and showed me the way back. That's what it means by comforting the Queen's enemies and fraternizing with humans. We must try to rescue him. Well, a lot we could do, said Edmund, when we haven't got anything to eat. Oh, shut up, you, said Peter, who was still very angry with Edmund. What do you think, Susan? I have a horrible feeling that Lou is right, said Susan. I don't want to go a step further, and I wish we'd never come, but I think we must try to do something for Mr. whatever his name is. I mean, the Fawn. Well, that's what I think too, said Peter. I'm worried about having no food with us. I'd vote for going back and getting something from the larder, only there doesn't seem to be any certainty of getting back into this country again once you got out of it. I think we'll have to go on. So do I, said both the girls. If only we knew where the poor chap was imprisoned, said Peter. They were all wondering what to do next when Lucy said, Look, there's a robin with such a red breast. It's the first bird I've seen here. I say, I wonder if birds can talk in Narnia. It almost looks like it wants to say something to us. And then she turned to the robin and she said, Please, can you tell us where Tumnus the Fawn has been taken to? Excuse me. As she said this, she took a step toward the bird. It at once flew away, but only as far as the next tree. There it perched and looked at them again very hard, as if it had understood everything they were saying. Almost without noticing they had done so, the four children went a step or two nearer to it. And then the robin flew away again to the next tree, and at once began to look at them very hard. You couldn't have found a robin with a redder breast or a brighter eye. Do you know, said Lucy, I really believe he wants us to follow him. I think he does, said Susan. What do you think, Peter? Well, we might as well try it, answered Peter. The robin appeared to understand the matter perfectly. He kept going from tree to tree, always a few yards ahead of them, but always so near that they could follow him easily. In this way, he led them on slightly downhill. Whenever the robin alighted, a little shower of snow would fall off the branch. Presently, the clouds parted overhead, and the winter sun came out, and the snow all around them grew dazzlingly bright. They had been traveling in this way for about half an hour when the two girls in front and Edmund said to Peter, If you're not still too high and mighty to talk to me, there's something I'd begot to say that you'd better listen to. What is it? Said Peter. Hush, not so loud, said Edmund. It's no good frightening the girls, but have you realized what we're doing? What? Said Peter, lowering his voice to a whisper. We're following a guide we don't know anything about. How do we know which side that bird is on? How do we know he's not leading us into a trap? That's a nasty idea. But it's a robin, you know. They're all good birds in the stories I've read. I'm sure a robin wouldn't be on the wrong side. Well, if it comes to that, what is the right side? How do we know the fawns are on the right? And the queen, yes, I know we've been told she's a witch. How do we know she's in the wrong? We don't really know anything about either of them. But the fawn saved Lucy. Well, he said he did, but how do we know? And there's another thing, too. Has anyone the least idea of the way home from here? Great Scott, said Peter. I hadn't thought of that. And no chance of dinner either, said Edmund. That's the end of chapter 6. And here's the picture of the sweet little robin. Robins in England are a little bit different than robins here. They do have a very bright orange breast feathers, but they're more the size of a sparrow, or if you know your birds, he's pretty close to the size of a finch or a tufted titmouse, one of those. Very cute. They like to hop around. Maybe next time I'll be able to bring you a picture of a robin and show you what an English robin looks like. I guess when American pilgrims and whatever came to this country and they saw what we call a robin, it was the only bird around with a red breast, so they called that big thrush that we now call a robin. That's what the name they gave it, because it reminded them of their sweet little birds at home. I expect that's probably the way it happened. Anyway, that's the end of chapter 6, and I'll look forward to seeing you again, maybe tomorrow, for chapter 7. Meanwhile, bye for now.